Order, order. We now come to the debate on the treatment of adults with autism by the criminal justice system, and I call Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship as ever, and I'm very pleased to have secured the debate this afternoon on this crucial topic which affects the lives of many adults with autism and the families who support them. And the subject, as you quite rightly say, Sir Edward, is adults with autism and what happens when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. It's understandable in this place and elsewhere that a lot of focus is given to children with autism, and that's quite right, given the need for educational and other support for them and for their parents and for their families. But of course, autism does not cease to be an issue when someone turns 18 and becomes an adult, and when many of the services which might be available for children fall away when people with autism become adults. Parents get older, and it's often more difficult to cope with the situation. Adults with autism are faced with a complex world outside of full-time education, where behaviours and traits associated with autism are often poorly understood, misinterpreted, or even mistaken sometimes for criminality. And I'd like to say some more about that in due course in my remarks. I'd first of all, though, like to acknowledge the work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, which has been supported by the National Autistic Society and many other campaigners, which has resulted in recent positive developments in the criminal justice system in relation to adults with autism. And I'd like to congratulate the APPG for being successful in securing the support of the former prisons minister, who wrote to all prisons in England and Wales, encouraging them to undertake autism accreditation. That's the member for South West Bedfordshire, I think, was the former prisons minister. And he wrote to all of the prisons encouraging them to undertake autism accreditation. And it's a pleasing thing, Sir Edward, that one prison has already been accredited. And as I understand it from the APPG website, there are 7 more undergoing that process. But there's a long way to go. There's more than well over 100 prisons in England and Wales. So there's a long way to go in making further progress on that. And recent cases which are featured in the press, such as that of a young man called Marcus Potter, show that the use of the prison system can in fact exacerbate the condition of those with autism rather than actually act in the public interest and cause deep distress and problems. In this case, a young man who has had an autism diagnosis since the age of 3 has got into trouble for his compulsive filming of the local police. And in his case, the judge decided to release him, Sir Edward, from prison, opting for a care plan and a probation instead, and concluded, and these are the judge's words, the worst place for you is where you are at the moment. So there's a lot of work to be done in relation to the issue of adults with autism and prisons, and there may be honourable members here who want to say something about that during the course of the debate this afternoon. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Just on that point, I've got the privilege of chairing the Westminster Autism Commission, and I don't know if you saw the recent report on the barriers to healthcare. And it's all these institutions, whether it's criminal justice, it's health, there has to be special consideration for people on the autism spectrum, because they are very hostile environments just because of the nature of that challenge.
Yes, and can I congratulate my honourable friend on the work he's doing on that commission and on the work he's done around health. And of course, one of the complexities about having a debate like this is which department should be answering a debate of this kind on autism. Sir Edward, I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets to say that, I received a phone call from the government saying, which department do you think should be replying to your debate? And I don't blame the government for that, by the way, because having been a government minister, I completely understand how government works. But one of the key problems is that difficulty in making sure that services are joined up across health, across the Justice Department, across the Attorney General's Department, across the Home Office, across the DWP, across the education system and so on. All of these play into each other. So even though today's debate is specifically about the criminal justice system, it's inevitable that these other issues play into the debate. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Does he think it might be worth government considering, perhaps with a Cabinet Office oversight, the way we have done with veterans, creating a Covenant of Veterans Board so that every department has someone absolutely focused on this issue, and the autism which affects every department and how we make forwards could actually drive this agenda much more comprehensively through the system?
Well, Sir Edward, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And in my experience in government, really, to get departments working together, you really do need to bring ministers together and not just officials in order to get progress. And ministers who understand and are committed and are passionately committed to make the change. And it is possible to make significant change simply by ensuring that ministers are brought together. And when I was a minister, I attempted a joint project with another minister, and the only way we could get it done, was by ensuring that we met regularly and we told our officials, you will do this, even though it's not within the culture of the department currently to do it. You will do it, and we're both telling you you'll do it, and you'll work together to do it. So I think her suggestion is an excellent one, and I hope the minister will take that on board, and perhaps even if he can't commit to doing that this afternoon, certainly commit to taking it away and discussing it with his colleagues. I will give way.
Honourable Bench, very generous. But isn't it the case that all the institutions are saying you actually have to have training for those people who are on the autism spectrum? I don't know if you noticed in the joint the debate last week, Alex Henry, an autistic young man, who was not involved in a case, but a boy that was with him stabbed someone. This young man is in prison for 19 years. He was an easily led young man on the autism spectrum. And people on the autism spectrum do tend to be quite easily led and are very impressionable. And, the criminal justice system should be sensitive to the needs of autistic people.
Again, I agree with my honourable friend, and I will come on to talk a little bit about the issue of making sure that there are joined-up understanding and that the criminal justice system needs to be able to identify and understand the vulnerabilities of people with autism when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. I was in the process of talking about a young man who had been sent to prison, and I pointed out there's a lot of work to be done on the issue of adults with autism and prisons. And I won't go on further about that today, but other honourable members may wish to speak to you, because I want to focus in my remarks on the earlier stages of the criminal justice system, and particularly issues around safeguarding and arrest. Now, people with autism can often exhibit behaviour that others categorise as unusual. Specific behaviours, such as stimming, a repetitive physical movement, which helps reinstate a sense of calm in a person with autism, is a particular trait to people with autism, and it's rarely understood by others. Indeed, most people I speak to, Sir Edward, have never even heard of stimming and don't know what it is. And as I said, behaviours that are seen to be unusual can sometimes be misinterpreted as antisocial, or even worse, as a criminal act. Indeed, it's been suggested that those who are the highest functioning on the autism spectrum can often bear the brunt of such misinterpretations, as their condition is not otherwise obviously visible, and so they aren't always extended the benefit of the doubt. And I hope that when the Minister responds this afternoon, that he'll outline what his views are and what's been done to try and prevent people with autism from being mistakenly criminalised by that misinterpretation of that particular trait. And what steps are being taken to ensure that the behaviour of those on the autistic spectrum is not misinterpreted by police and by the judiciary. Now, when adults on the autistic spectrum do come under suspicion of criminal behaviour, safeguarding at that point, Sir Edward, becomes crucial. And I want to refer to a case, the case of a constituent of mine, but one who wishes to remain anonymous for obvious reasons. And I just want to refer to the fact that the safeguards in the criminal justice system did not protect him as they should have under current policy and practice. Now, due to his understandable desire not to be named public, I won't go too far into the detailed circumstances which led to the arrest of my constituent on 2 different occasions. I know that ministers are aware of the details of the case through previous meetings and correspondence, but suffice to say that his stimming was misinterpreted whilst travelling in crowded conditions on public transport, and that's what led to his arrest. He declared his autism before he was arrested, which should have triggered a different pathway from a normal arrest. But he was not diverted or safeguarded at the point of contact as he should have been. On the first occasion, no appropriate adult was called, his parents were not contacted as they should have been, and he was not assessed as fit for interview. And there was a caution issued against him, which was later quashed due to these lapses in procedure. Unfortunately, he was arrested again 3 years later, and his vulnerability and protected characteristics were not properly recognised by the police or the health professional who assessed him. The reasonable adjustments, in other words, Sir Edward, that are required by law were not made during his detention or subsequently, and that case then was dropped without charge. Now, in January 2009, Lord Bradley, who, of course, is a former member of this House and who pays very close attention, Sir Edward, to these kinds of proceedings, he published his review of people with mental health problems or learning disabilities in the criminal justice system. And his report set out a policy of liaison and diversion for those with these kinds of issues away from police custody for assessment by clinicians prior to arrest and custody. Now, at this point, I want to be perfectly clear. Diversion doesn't mean not having to answer to the allegations, Sir Edward, but it does mean that behaviours associated with autism are properly contextualised, and both the accused and the evidence is properly protected, and that an appropriate adult is present, as I mentioned earlier. And Lord Bradley specified in his report, and I quote, "Studies into the use of appropriate adults have concluded that the provision of the appropriate adult is very inconsistent. Firstly, the needs of a defendant have to be identified, which are often missed. Even when a need for an appropriate adult is identified, there is currently a shortage of individuals who can perform the role effectively." Now, my contention is, Sir Edward, that if Lord Bradley's recommendations had been properly followed at the time my constituent was arrested in 2011 and 2014, it is certainly possible that the trauma he and his family have suffered could have been subsequently avoided. And my constituents are not the only ones who had such misunderstandings with the police. In fact, the National Autistic Society has said, and I quote, "Our charity still hears regularly from autistic people and families who say that responding police did not understand autism and did not respond appropriately." And this causes unnecessary distress to the individual and to the police attending. So, I will in one moment, yes. I will in 1 second. I'm going to ask him to sit down for 1 second while I finish my point. Okay. And that is, in driving home my point before he helps me, I'm going to say to the Minister, can we have an assurance from him at the end of the debate that he will go back and look at Lord Bradley's proposals and make sure that they are being fully implemented across the system? And I will now, with great pleasure, give way to my honourable friend.
It's such a good speech, but it's stimulating me to remind him of the court system. Actually, very often, it derides a professional opinion about the case, the facts of autism. And probably the best-known expert on autism in the country is Professor Baron Cohen at Cambridge University. And in 2 recent cases, Lowry Love who is in danger of being sent to the United States, where he will almost certainly be in danger of committing suicide. His evidence, the professor's evidence, was dismissed out of hand. In fact, attacked. He was attacked as an expert when he was in court. And that's happened in a number of cases where professionals who know about autism are disregarded. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the phenomenon he describes is a very distressing one, and that he's absolutely right to describe Professor Baron Cohen as being one of the world's experts in this area, and it is obviously highly concerning that his evidence wouldn't be taken seriously in an instance such as he described. So I hope the Minister will give consideration to that and consider whether or not in future the government might think there's any legislation required in this area to make sure that the sorts of recommendations made by Lord Bradley are actually happening across the system. Now, the issues that I am raising today were borne out in a study from the University of Bath, Sir Edward, which published in 2016. And their survey of almost 400 police officers found that only 42% of officers, so a minority of officers, were satisfied with how they had worked with individuals on the autism spectrum. 37% of officers had received specific training on how to work with individuals on the autism spectrum, but many found that even that training was not tailored to their specific roles within the police force. And in addition, organisation and time constraints were cited as specific barriers. So I wonder, again, if the Minister, in his response, can tell us what assessment he's made of the effects of the continuing cuts to police budgets on the training that's offered to police officers and staff working with adults on the autistic spectrum. And what will he do following this debate to ensure that safeguarding policies are properly put into action across the board? Now, the National Autistic Society has a free resource aimed at police officers and staff, which offers a guide to working with people on the autistic spectrum. And I hope the Minister will be able to join with me in publicly encouraging police services in England and Wales to use this resource, and if appropriately in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, but to use this resource and can seriously consider its guidance. As I said, in relation to my constituent, the allegations made against them resulted in a caution that was quashed, and those allegations in the second instance were dropped. But to his great distress, these erroneous allegations remain on the police databases. And at the time of his arrest, my constituent was living and working across the border in England, not in Cardiff. But the discovery that the allegations against him were kept on police databases, despite the police having acknowledged that they were inaccurate, caused him very severe psychiatric harm, as was confirmed by 2 separate psychiatric reports. And as a result, my constituent ended up giving up his job, his flat, and his independence to return home to live with his parents in Cardiff. Now, that cannot be an outcome that we want to see for an adult with autism who's established independence and a productive role in society, in the workplace. It shows the life-changing effects that the lack of safeguarding can actually end up having. The allegations remain on police records. The Chief Executive of the relevant NHS Trust invited both the police and the Independent Police Complaints Commission to send representatives to 2 meetings to discuss how they could help safeguard my constituent from further psychiatric harm, and I'm sad to say they didn't attend either meeting. And despite extensive and complex complaints being made to the relevant agencies, those made to the Police and Independent Police Complaints Commission remain unresolved, and my constituent and his family have grave concerns about the governance and compliance with required standards demonstrated in the handling of their complaints. Now, there's no evidence that the police service involved have recognised my constituent's continuing vulnerability or put in place plans to respond appropriately and safely in the event of further contact with him. And in my view, therefore, they've neglected to safeguard him from possible future risk of harm. And prior and subsequent to the first incident, he was studying for a degree and travelling daily on public transport. Prior to the second incident, he was working full-time, but however, his experiences, and in particular the failure to remove or amend the allegations, as was predicted by the senior medical consultants who assessed him, resulted in serious impairment of his health and development, with significant increase in his anxiety and impact on his functioning. And as I said, as a result, he lost his employment and moved back home and is no longer able to travel independently on public transport. So I think in pursuing his case, my constituent and his parents have unearthed many worrying inconsistencies. For example, he was told originally by the police that the case against him was not pursued on public interest grounds, whereas the Solicitor General later confirmed it had been dropped through a lack of evidence, two very different reasons not to prosecute. And honourable members will recall, Sir Edward, on the 30th of November, just last year, when we had a Commons debate on the autism community, mental health and suicide, reference was made to recent research findings that autistic people are 9 times more likely to kill themselves than the average population. For people on the autistic spectrum, contact with the criminal justice system can often come at moments of heightened anxiety. As such, it's crucial that all parties are fully informed and trained to find a solution that does not cause undue distress, or in the case of my constituent, severe psychiatric harm. So I urge the Minister to listen to today's debate, to listen to the suggestions from honourable members, to speak with his colleagues in government, and to seek to find a way to work in a more joined-up fashion in a ministerial-led initiative in order to make sure that what happened to my constituent doesn't happen to him again, and more importantly, doesn't happen to others, and to ensure that in this country we have a reputation across the world for having the highest standards in dealing with the issues faced by adults with autism.